Welcome to the Ready Brew. My name's T. Edge, King Beacon for the Brew. And today I want to talk about why the church doesn't value black people. It's simple, really. And I know that there are going to be some questions. One of the first questions people might ask is, what do you mean the church doesn't care about black people? Everything that happened for black people came through the church. And I would say that's incorrect. What about the civil rights movement? Well, the church didn't care about the civil rights movement. In fact, at no point in history did the church care about the civil rights of black people or the so-called Negro in America. And of course, I want to talk about it. So let's just jump right into it. The first thing I want to look into is today's church. What are they really saying about civil rights? What are they really saying about social justice issues? One of the leading voices on social justice happens to be the voice of a black man. This is what he had to say.
There's a lot of academic literature that lays out and defines social justice. William Young, Academic Social Science and Social Justice. He writes, while often an amorphous term, social justice has evolved to generally mean state redistribution of advantages and resources to disadvantaged groups to satisfy their rights and social and economic equality. Social justice is state redistribution. That's what social justice means. State redistribution. It is not a heart issue. Biblical perspective, justice is a heart issue and a law of God issue. Amen? It is a heart issue and a law of God issue. If the law of God says this and you do that, it is unjust. If the law of God says this and your heart goes toward that, it is unjust. Social justice, by definition, is not a heart issue, it's a state issue. And it's about state redistribution. And redistribution, again, advantages and resources to disadvantaged groups. Social justice is not about individuals, it's about groups. Another very important distinction. It's not about individuals, it's about groups and outcomes.
At another conference where he brought friends, another one of his associates discussed Martin Luther King and how he was not really a Christian.
Social justice movement. But I literally sat stunned as I watched MLK 50. Hearing was said earlier about some of the things that occurred. I heard Eric Mason talk about blacks who are black on the outside, Anglo on the inside. I was stunned to see MLK lifted up and given unqualified praise. MLK, who didn't preach a biblical gospel, was portrayed as a genuine believer. This was then essentially repeated at T4G in a panel there. I was troubled to see someone stand on stage at MLK 50 and take a swipe at Vody just because he was unwilling to accept the false narratives surrounding the Michael Brown event. That was stunning to me that took place. So there's an assault not outside our camp, there's an assault inside our camp. And and that is one of the reasons why I think that we need to be concerned. Because what's deeply troubling is I've observed from men that I greatly respect, men that I have pointed my church to read, men that I believe that we listen here that are of like mind theologically in this room. I've observed them not using the language of Scripture, not having a commitment to the exclusivity of the gospel in this matter. The standard of God's holy law is not what's being upheld. A commitment to the sufficiency of Scripture is being abandoned, I believe. And these things are, those things are not what's pulling the social justice train. And I've come to learn that so much of the conversation is really worldly philosophy.
And you think I'm really pulling these things out of nowhere. But let me read you a passage from the book, The Religious Instruction of the Negro. Dr. Dalcho of the Episcopal Church and his practical considerations, etc. Written in Charleston in the year 1823, on page 6. Ignorant and indolent by nature, improvident and depraved by habit, and destitute of the moral principle, as they generally appear to be, ages and generations must pass away before they could be made virtuous, honest, and useful members of society. The Honorable Charles Cotesworth Pinckney. His address before the Agricultural Society of South Carolina, Charleston, 1829. The second edition, pages 10 and 12. There needs to be no stronger illustration of the doctrine of human depravity than the state of the morals of the plantations in general. Besides the mischievous tendency of bad example in parents and elders, the little Negro is often taught by his natural instructors that he may commit any vice he can conceal from his supervisors, and thus falsehood and deception are among the earliest things he gets himself involved in. Their advancing years but a progression to the higher grades of iniquity. The violation of the severest commandment is viewed in the more venial light than in the fashionable European circle. Their depredations of rice have been estimated to amount to 25% on the gross average of the crops. And this calculation was made after 50 years' experience by one whose liberal provision for their wants left me excuses for their ingratitude. This is of the Western Luminary. We know that many of them are included in the visible church and frequently exhibit great zeal, but it is to be feared that it is often a zeal without knowledge. And of the majority, it must be confessed that this light shineth in darkness, and the darkness comprehended it not. After making all reasonable allowance, our colored population can be considered, at the most, but semi-heathen. They didn't really think highly of it. Let's look a little bit further into what they thought about civil rights. In this same book, on page 271, it reads, "The manner of speaking and acting in relation to the civil condition of the Negro. As ministers of missionaries to the Negroes, in the discharge of our official duty, and in our intercourse with the Negroes, we should have nothing to do with their civil condition. In other words, their civil rights ain't our business. We are appointed of God to preach the unsearchable riches of Christ to our perishing fellow men. We are to meditate upon the duties and responsibilities of our office and to give ourselves wholly to it. We shall by so doing, in the most effectual manner, subserve the interests of masters and servants for time and eternity." The free Negro, the moral and religious condition of the free Negro population. Conclusion of the subject. They are emphatically lovers of pleasure and of shame. All kinds of amusements, except those which involve labor of reflection, possess great attractions for them, and their indulgences is limited only by their means of access to them. They make in fine clothes, their appearance to the Sabbath, and on public days and anything else but an index of the fortune and comfort at home, proverbially idle. Drunkenness with its attendant woes hurries large numbers of them to sudden and untimely ends. Theft is still with them, and the state of freedom a characteristic vice. Lewdness without bounds, great numbers both in the slave and free states not only pursue the vice, but are trained up to it as a means of living. The number of respectable individuals is considerably greater indeed, but the character of the mass nearly the same. Nor can it be urged that they are here debated access to the ordinary means of moral and intellectual regeneration. This comes from the Carey's letters, letter number 12. And there is no reason to expect that the lapse of centuries will make any change in this respect. The jealousy with which they are regarded, they will always, unhappily, be regarded as an inferior race. These words come from church leaders. So again, it wasn't their place in their eyes to care about the civil liberties of the Negro. And they still say the same things today that they said about the Negro back in the early 1800s. I know there's still going to be some that say, well, look, America had our first black president in Barack Obama. They're going to say things like, look at the way black people treat each other. If black people didn't kill each other, then it wouldn't give other races a reason to hate us. But as you can see, this has been going on since we've been here. But where did it all begin? Did this just start with the American black or the slaves in America? Let's take a little trip back in time, if you will. In this same book, The Religious Instruction of the Negro, on page number 2, it says the account of the introduction of Negroes into the colonies under the government of Great Britain. It was in the year 1501 that Isabella of Spain granted permission for the introduction of Negro slaves into Hispaniola, but such only as had been born in Spain or in slavery among the Christians. And in the following year, a few had been sent into the New World. In 1508, the Spaniards opened a direct line of trade in slaves and imported Negroes into Hispaniola from the Portuguese settlements on the coast of Guinea. Ferdinand, by royal ordinance, enjoined a direct traffic in slaves between Guinea and Hispaniola in 1511, and Charles in 1512 and 1513. In 1517, Charles granted a patent to one of his Flemish favorites, containing an exclusive right to import slaves, 4,000 annually, into Hispaniola, Cuba, Jamaica, and Puerto Rico. That 1501 date is very important because when we go to another book, we learn something very vital. But it's important to note that in the religious instruction of the Negro, it stated that these slaves were born into slavery in Spain. So what does this book about Isabella say? It was the design of ameliorating the condition of the natives that she sanctioned the introduction into the colonies of Negro slaves born in Spain in 1501. This she did on the impression that the physical constitution of the African was much better fitted than that of the Indian to endure severe toil under a tropical climate. To this false principle of economizing human suffering, we are indebted for that soul stain on the New World, which has grown deeper and darker with the lapse of years. On page 163 of this same book, it says, under the Visigoth Empire, the Jews multiplied exceedingly in the country and were permitted to acquire considerable power and wealth. But no sooner had their Aryan masters embraced the Orthodox faith than they began to testify their zeal by pouring on the Jews the most pitiless storm of persecution. One of their laws alone condemned the whole race to slavery. And the Montesquieu remarks, without much exaggeration, that to the Gothic code may be traced all the maxims of the modern Inquisition. The monks of the 15th century only copying in reference to the Israelites, the bishops of the 7th. The Visigoths were the Germans. The Germans actually reigned in Spain. So the lie that the Jews, who were the slaves condemned by the Queen in 1492, and later called Negroes in 1501, were the Jews that lived in the area. The Germans actually controlled or had power and ruled in these areas. So there's no way that Jews could have been profitable in the slave trade because they were hated amongst the Spaniards and the Germans or the Visigoths. So if we go back a little bit further, if we look a little bit deeper, if we dive down just a little bit more, the question may come to mind: why or how did this hatred for Negroes or Jews become so prevalent? We've got to go back to the beginning of the Christian church. You see, here in America, most of us are Protestant believers. Our Protestant beliefs come from the protesting of the Catholic faith, particularly the Roman Catholic Church. But the Roman Catholic Church is not a church of isolation. The Roman Catholic Church actually comes from the Eastern Orthodox Catholics. They split. The Eastern Orthodox made sure that the Jews were pushed away or pushed out or exiled from the priesthood, because in their minds, Christ had now come to give the priesthood to the Gentiles. So yes, the Jews were able to come into the faith of Christianity, but the idea was that they were no longer to be considered the priesthood that God had called them to. Because of this, there were great persecutions throughout all the Greek territories. And just so happens, there's a video that was put out by the History Channel that I want you to take a look at, just a few snippets from.
I'm Don Wildman. I'm in Addis Ababa, capital of Ethiopia. It's called the Cradle of Humanity. It's one of the oldest nations on Earth. Little is understood about the vast kingdoms that ruled this land for thousands of years. But during biblical times, their remote highlands were an important safe haven for refugees escaping persecution and war in faraway lands. Relatively little study has been done here. So, as this developing land moves slowly into the 21st century, many of its deepest and darkest secrets can still only be found in the underground. To Today, Ethiopia is a remote, landlocked East African nation, a religious time capsule, so isolated that Christians here still worship in ways that would be familiar to Jesus' first disciples. Christianity began to spread from Jerusalem to the ancient world in the 2nd century AD as believers preached the gospel and converted new members. The first conversions in Ethiopia were in the 4th century, and the new religion caught on. By the 12th century, Christianity was the dominant religion here. Its holiest city, Lalibela, was a pilgrimage site modeled on Jerusalem. The long tunnel system in the southeast cluster leads to the Gabriel and Raphael churches, which are completely surrounded by a hand-carved trench ranging from 15 to over 50 feet deep. So this looks like a defensive wall. I mean, this is carved out, right?
And this goes all the way to the other side too.
And this waterway here would have been like a moat.
Yeah, this is like a moat, or you can say like drainage, which flows all the way down. You can...
Yeah, perfect defense posture here. In the 12th century, when King Lalibela built his New Jerusalem in the remote mountains of Ethiopia, his Zagwe kingdom was relatively isolated from the turmoil gripping the Holy Land of Jerusalem, 1,400 miles north. Like a medieval castle, this church only has one way in, a bridge 50 feet up, another clue pointing to military origins. And like a fortress prepared for a long siege, it may also have had its own water supply. My Lord, how deep
The
is
area
this
of Lalibela
Very deep.
is a connection of
Like
churches.
water system underneath.
Yeah, that's
But
what that is.
most importantly,
In the rainy season,
this
this
area
cistern could
of
collect
Lalibela
enough water to last the people here for months.
actually
If this
models
was as much a
Jerusalem.
fortress as a church, then that could
That
have
tells
been
us
water
that the
supply.
creators of
Yes,
Lalibela
it could be for the church or
were
for fortifications.
acquainted
That's
with
exactly what it was.
the area
It's
of
totally
Jerusalem.
unique, and other churches
They
don't
had to be,
So what
in
happened
some
in the church is
respect,
just holy water, not like as water
descendants
cistern
from the
here.
people of
Nature
the
water.
land.
So building a massive hydroengineering system that could move floodwaters out while collecting some of the life-giving water made Lalibela's isolated existence possible. The complex collects and stores huge reserves of both rain and artesian spring water. And if the people here were afraid of attack from outsiders or infidels, an enormous reservoir of water would be essential. In the time of Jesus Christ, while the Roman Empire was spreading across the world, there was another mighty empire on the rise, the Axomites of Ethiopia. I'm heading to a mountainous region, more than 300 miles north of Addis, to the city of Axum. Now a small farming town, it was once the rich capital city of a mighty empire that dominated much of northeastern Africa for 600 years. Tradition has it that the Axomite kings traced their lineage back to King Solomon, and even claimed that his son brought the Ark of the Covenant, at the time a Jewish relic believed to have mysterious powers, to Ethiopia in the 10th century BC. The Axomites' link to King Solomon, as evidenced by their exclusive claim to the Ark of the Covenant, did two important things. One, it helped give their kings legitimacy to the throne. And two, it helped create an entirely singular, unique brand of Christianity. Now, some of the only clues left of this one-time world power are located right across the street in a field of obelisks and inside the mysterious tombs of a lost empire. Like Egypt, Axum was one of the ancient world's great empires for 600 years. From the 1st century AD to the 7th century AD, they mastered major trade routes between India and the Mediterranean and across the Red Sea, exporting luxury goods like ivory, spices, and gold. Proof of the Axomites' wealth and power is here, a field of over 120 towering obelisks, including the largest monolithic stone in the ancient world, the grave markers of Axomite royalty. Erected sometime in the 400 years after the birth of Christ, they weigh up to 500 tons, and each was cut from a single stone and hauled here, some say by elephants, from miles.
They are here to mark tombs for the royal family.
Okay. And bolstered on two sides by gigantic horizontal stones. Surrounding the central foundation are several underground rooms used to entomb the dead and seal away incredible riches. War and lack of resources have made archaeology a luxury in modern Ethiopia, and 90% of these tombs are still unexplored. This is insanely huge. Like the pyramids in Egypt, this elaborately carved stele marks the final resting place for a king who is as formidable as any pharaoh. Beautiful. Now these are the chambers here.
The chambers here.
There's 10 of these.
Yeah.
And each one of these chambers would be a burial place.
A burial and a treasury as well.
Oh, okay.
Because even before the death of the king, they were used as a store where they keep the treasures. And after the death of the king, the treasures were used for the life after death.
So this is like in Egypt. They would build these tombs before the king actually died.
Yes, exactly.
Okay. If you're upstairs looking around at this field, you see stelae, all these obelisks everywhere in this huge field. Each one of them is the marker for a grave beneath. Only 5% of them have been excavated. Imagine what you see is now an empty room filled with ivory tusks, gold, silver, everything that this king would represent himself with in the afterlife. This is how prosperous the Axomites were. These burial rites ended in the 4th century AD when the Axomite kings adopted Christianity, and a Jewish relic they had possessed for centuries became their greatest treasure, the Ark of the Covenant. Rumors have placed this precious artifact all over the world, but this is the land of King Solomon's son, Menelik, and many believe he brought the Ark home. Legend says it's still here today, in this small church just across the road from the pagan tombs. By the 6th century AD, 1400 years after the Ark may have first arrived here, the Western world was in chaos. The Roman Empire had fallen, and Europe was mired in the horror of the Dark Ages. But the Axomite Empire was at its peak, and just a mile from the pagan obelisks, their Christian king Caleb built a magnificent final resting place, a tomb that may have lured the relic-hunting Knights Templar, searching for the Axomites' greatest treasure.
The last Axomite king's tomb.
Really?
It belongs to the son of King Caleb. This is the room for the grave with 3 sarcophagus.
Right.
Ready for him and for his wife and for his son or daughter. And one sarcophagus is different from the others because it's with a cross, with Axomite hand cross.
Carved in the end there.
We do have one Axomite cross right here.
It does look like a Templar cross.
Exactly. But Templars were 11th century, but this is even the Axomite used in the coin in the 4th century AD. That's why we call it Axomite one.
This cross, almost identical to the Crusader symbol, predates it by 7 centuries. It could be a coincidence, or it could prove Europeans were here looking for the Ark. Many claim the Knights Templar dug for it under the Temple Mount.
The commentator wants us to believe that this cross comes from the Knights Templar.
They may have come to Axum as well.
But his guide makes sure that he understands that this cross existed centuries before the Knights Templar arrived.
For the Ark of the Covenant. So they adopted some elements like a cross like this, which they call it the Knight Templars or the Crusaders cross letter.
Fascinating. That's where this is from. Cool. Did the predecessors of the Knights Templar come here searching for the Ark? And did they find it? Or is the greatest treasure in Christianity still locked away in a small church in a dusty town?
They let us know that the Jews of Constantinople, which was a Greek territory, which was the territory of Constantine, who wrote this letter, they made sure that they persecuted the Jews. And the persecution was so great that they pushed them completely out of the territory. These Jews ended up in what is now known as Ethiopia.
This is Abune
Yamata. Abune Yamata is a name of the monk from one of the 9 saints who established this church at the monastery in the 6th century AD.
Okay, so 500 AD, this was done. And so they came this high up for the isolation, I suppose.
For isolation, to lead spiritual life only,
Okay.
to get rid of the secular life.
And the protection, obviously, from being so far up above everything.
Exactly.
All right, can we go in?
Yeah.
Look at this sheer rock face right here. You fall off that, you are gone. The length they went to put a monastery up here on the top of a mountain. Amazing. I had no idea this was going to be as spectacular as it is. I mean, it's really extravagantly painted. What am I looking at here?
This is representing the monk on the back of the horse, which represent the founder of the monastery, Abuna Yamata, one of the 9 saints. Here you have the 9 saints.
All right.
Abuna Yamata was one of the 9 saints who fled persecution in Constantinople and found sanctuary here in northern Ethiopia. They followed a religious doctrine known as Monophysitism, which held that Jesus Christ was entirely divine, as opposed to being divine and human, as many Western Christians believed. It was a doctrine that challenged the Christian leadership, branded them as heretics, and could have cost them their lives.
Every inch of this place has a figure on it.
Yeah.
They are telling the stories and I see the Virgin Mary here, definitely. This incredible artwork. When the 9 saints came to Ethiopia, they brought with them an entirely new style of painting, which became a biblical teaching tool. Now, do people actually come and use this place presently now?
What makes very interesting is also children are baptized in here, so the women has to come up all, with these climbs.
With their babies?
With the babies on their back.
Wow.
So you see, this church is quite active every time.
All right, very important to the local
Very
community.
important, very important.
So all these Bibles and prayer books here, he's going to show us. The priest has opened one up. Can we see inside one? These are very, very old. And hand script here and hand painted, I guess. Huh?
Yeah.
On what? What is this material? It's
skin.
sheepskin.
Sheepskin.
Uh-huh. Can I page? Oh, thank you. Oh, yeah. And this language is which?
Geese.
Geese. This is the oldest language in Ethiopia. It's like the equivalent of Latin.
Exactly.
For them. How close is the Ethiopian Orthodox Church to that which an American would know?
Well, in Ethiopia, the Orthodox Church, we have some more books like this, which are, partly from the Bible, partly outside the Bible.
Yeah.
For example, Miracle of Saint Mary is only in Ethiopia. You don't find somewhere else in the world.
Right. Different customs, of course, a different language.
Yeah.
All kinds of things that a Western Christian might find strange.
Yeah.
Really erupting from a totally unique culture, a different religion. Thank you so much. Yahangeli.
Today, Christianity has spread to every corner of the world. But here, in the isolated highlands of Ethiopia, you can see how Jesus' early disciples may have worshipped. A priceless glimpse into the past, safely stored away in the underground.
Christianity as we know it today is not the Christianity that God ordained. Instead, this Christianity is the concoction of men. Men who wanted to replace the Jews. Looking at the letter from Constantine, we see that he was very much a devout Christian. In deed, not so much in word. He made sure that the Christians didn't follow the customs of the Jews. I'm not at all saying that we dismiss Christ. It's time that we again look to God, not just as believers, but as the Hebrews who God made covenant with in the wilderness. The remembrance of this covenant is not for us to think that we can fulfill the law, but the remembering of this covenant is so that we can realize that we should be humble. As you take a look into this information further, just know that we can still call ourselves Christian, But we must understand that it's bigger than the Catholic faith and the Catholic religion. We are to now recognize Christ, who came to save Israel from the curse. Thank you for giving me your attention today. If you have any questions or concerns, if you think I didn't get it right, or you think there's some things that need to be corrected, leave some comments down below. Don't forget to subscribe. Don't forget to hit that notification bell. But in the meantime, thank you again for joining. Peace.